Man. And I'm going to share my screen. Oh, okay. I'm going to need to share my screen. All right. And the answer is 1% met standard for fish consumption. A lot of you got that right. This says 95% met standard for drinking water. That is not true, sadly. Only 38% made the standard and 43 did not. So it's not, tilting in our favor here. And finally, for swimming and boating, we just put swimming, but it's swimming and boating. 43% did not meet the standard. And that's for rivers and ponds. That's not for the ocean. The ocean was found to be good. But so what I think this does is it gives you an idea of what's at stake here. So definitely flooding is an issue, and we want to know what we can do to make sure that we don't have to deal with it any more than we have to. And we've got some other things to think about. So we are going to get into our program, and the first thing I'm going to do is introduce Sophie Glovier. And she is a municipal policy specialist at Watershed Institute, where she works with citizens and local governments to develop and implement strong environmental policy. She's a chair of Princeton Environmental Commission, which I've been on environmental commissions. That's a big undertaking, and is a team member for climate change conversations, helping to educate about the risks of climate change. She's author of Walk the Trails in and Around Princeton, and is a recipient of the DNR Greenway Land Trust Donald B. Jones Award and Sustainable Princeton's Leadership Award. That's great. She went undergrad to Princeton University, then Columbia Business School, and has a postmaster's certificate in sustainability strategy. So I am going to stop sharing and turn it over to you, Sophie, and take us away.
Okay, great. I will just share my presentation. Give me a thumbs up if you can see that. Great. Well, thank you, Mary, and thank you, Faith, again, who did knit us all together, and all of the collaborating partners in getting this great audience together. It was good to see in the poll that flooding is a major concern of this audience, as it is with many across the state. And one of the reasons I was so excited to talk to you tonight is that we have a unique opportunity between now and March of next year to really take action on a local level to address flooding and water pollution in each of our towns. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. Just a few words about the Watershed Institute, where I work. We have been established since 1949, and keeping our water clean, safe, and healthy is at the heart of our mission. We work to protect and restore our water here in central New Jersey through 4 strategies: conservation, advocacy, science, and education. Important to our presentation tonight is our focus on scientific investigation and monitoring on a very local level of our waterways. We have a citizen science program where volunteers each month test the water, and the results of that testing informs our policy work, our advocacy work, which takes place at the state level, but also at a very local level with environmental commissions, planning boards, and governing bodies, really drawing on what we learn through our scientific research. We have a large education program from the young in our community, the preschoolers, all the way through adult education, with a growing focus on green infrastructure education. And that's a term you'll be hearing a lot about this evening. And lastly, we have a 950-acre reserve with some beautiful trails and a Platinum LEED Environmental Center, which sadly is not open right now, but you can come and see our rain gardens and our constructed wetlands and our green roof. So if you're in the neighborhood of Pennington, New Jersey, I would encourage you to do that. Tonight with the presentation, I want to do three things. Give you some context for the problem of flooding and water pollution in New Jersey, what's contributing to that, why is it getting worse? Talk about this concrete suggestion for how you can make a difference in your town between now and March, and talk about what success would look like if we can all work together on this. So just to start with the fact that flooding is a major problem, obviously all of us on this call recognize that given the results of the poll. And there are several reasons for that. One of them is that what we're seeing in New Jersey is that the average amount of precipitation that we are receiving every year is increasing. This is based on data from our state climatologist, David Robinson, and we are experiencing on average almost 3.5 inches more rain than we did in the last century. And that might not sound like a very large amount, but when you do the math, that results in 526 billion more gallons of water each year falling on New Jersey. And we're not just having more water fall on us, the way in which we're receiving this precipitation is changing. This is a chart from Climate Central, and it shows the percent increase from 1958 to 2016 of that top 1% of extreme rain events. And you can see that here in the Northeast, we've increased that percent of those top 1% of intense rainstorms, 55%. And according to the report on climate change recently issued by the state, here in New Jersey, over the past 50 years, the storms that have resulted in extreme rain have increased by 71%, a faster rate than anywhere in the United States. And because of increased climate change, that trend is likely to continue. And at the same time that we are experiencing more water and more water falling in more extreme rain events, development pressure continues, and that results in increase in impervious surface, those surfaces that rain can't fall through. So here on the left, you can see a graph that shows changes in land use in New Jersey from the late 1980s until 2012. You can see that red color, which is urban land use, expanding. And we know that more impervious cover is associated with urban land use. Here in our watershed, the Millstone watershed, between 1995 and 2012, impervious surface increased by more than 30% to more than 20,000 acres. And we know this information hasn't been updated, but there's certainly been a lot of development between 2012 and the present. It's important to recognize that as we add impervious cover, we're changing the way our watershed works. So in this picture, we see what happens in a natural watershed. When it rains, half of that water infiltrates into the ground, 40% evapotranspires, and only 10% is running off to our streams and rivers. But in this example, where we have a very developed urban watershed, where there's 75 to 100% impervious cover, only 15% of that water is able to infiltrate, and over half is now running off, which happens very quickly, can cause flooding, and that runoff is carrying all of the pollutants that it is accumulating on those impervious surfaces as it runs off. Scientists tell us that once a watershed gets over 10% of impervious cover, we start to see negative impacts on the waterways. And many of us here in New Jersey are living in municipalities that have significantly above a 10% impervious cover. So that impervious cover is an important one to know for your town, and there may be several sub-watersheds, probably are, within your town. When we go to talk to local towns, we like to take these videos, which you can find on a map called New Jersey Conservation Blueprint. Can be found at NJMap2 is the website. And this is one we did for Millstone Township. I'll just play the video now. You'll see purple color pop up. That's the impervious cover as of 1986, and you can watch as it grows. This data is in 5-year increments all the way up through 2015. So it really gives you a sense of the increase in impervious cover, and that's very interesting for policymakers to see on a local basis, and often they aren't familiar with the number. Just to bring it down to a residential scale, I think when we think about impervious surface, we picture large parking lots and big developments. So I think it's really instructive to think about how much runoff a roof, not a large roof, a 2,800 square foot roof in a 1-inch rainstorm generates. 1,680 gallons of water. So we all are contributing significantly to stormwater runoff. So when we add up these problems, changes in our precipitation because of climate change, more impervious surface, and pollution, we get the #1 cause of water pollution here in New Jersey, and that's polluted stormwater runoff. And right now, the problem is getting worse. But the good news is that we do have an opportunity at a local level to take action to address that. Oh, I did want to show you, this is data from our citizen science program. And it gives some illustrations on a very local level of what is impairing our water quality. So we see presence of E. coli, we see elevated levels of phosphate, we see the condition, aquatic life not supported in the way that we would like to. And another indication of the challenges our waterways are facing is the fact that harmful algal blooms are increasing. And I know that Jason's going to talk a lot more about this later, so I won't spend too much time on it, but you can see to the right there, this is a map from the New Jersey DEP showing harmful algal blooms identified in the summer of 2019. And you can go to their website and watch what's happening this summer as well. So why is it so impactful to work on this issue at a local level? Well, here in New Jersey, we are a strong home rule state, and that means that local government plays an important role. In many cases, excuse me, I have an environmentally friendly office here, so if I don't move, I go into darkness. In New Jersey, local governments are empowered to enact stronger environmental regulations than the state standard to protect the health and safety of their residents. So what is the tool that a local government uses to address polluted stormwater runoff? Well, it is called a Stormwater Management Ordinance. That's a local law that lays out the requirements for stormwater management for new development and potentially redevelopment. These are created on a town-by-town basis, often working from a template created by the state, which is called a model ordinance. Ordinance drafting is often overseen by your municipal engineer. The planning board will provide comment on your ordinance, and your municipal governing body will consider it and approve it. So the opportunity that we have is as a result of a new rule from the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. Each town in New Jersey must adopt and receive county approval for a new stormwater management ordinance by March of next year. As I said, local ordinances can be stronger than the state standard. And for this reason, we can use your help in advocating for strong stormwater management ordinances. Now, in order to do that, we need to know a little bit about stormwater, which might not be a topic that you've thought a lot about. So I'm going to give you just a quick primer. The old thinking about stormwater management was to take any water that was standing and causing a problem in a developed property and to get it away from that property as quickly as possible. There was some talk about flooding basements earlier. So to take that water and just get it away so it wouldn't flood your basement, to get it directly into a grate or a storm drain and right out to a stream or a river. But that approach had some unintended consequences. First of all, that water now might not be your problem, but it is someone else's problem downstream. And as those problems are added together, they can make big impacts. In addition, the pollutants that are picked up by this stormwater and carried to the streams aren't having the opportunity to infiltrate and be cleaned by the soils and plants. And lastly, that water is now running off so fast that there isn't opportunity for that recharge, that infiltration, and this can harm our aquifers. So we think of this as kind of the old approach, or like the Model T of stormwater management. And the new thinking is that what a best practice is to retain that stormwater on site for a period of time to allow it to infiltrate into the groundwater. And there are different strategies for doing this. One of them is a rain garden, which you can see here, that can hold that water, allow it to drain and clean. On the right hand, we have what's called a vegetated swale, which again uses a natural grading and plants to direct the water and to allow for infiltration and to manage the flow that way. And then in the middle, we have something called a rain bladder, which can hold water during one of those intense storms and then either let it out slowly or use it for a gray water purpose. So this new thinking has the benefits of reducing flooding, reducing water pollution, and recharging our aquifers. In addition, when these so-called green infrastructure solutions are implemented, the ones that use plants and mimic natural solutions, there are all kinds of co-benefits, including native plant habitat. We know that green spaces are good for people's mental health and lots of other benefits, energy efficiency of green roofs, etc. So this is really the Tesla, or the new approach to stormwater management. And here are just a few examples. This is a project that was installed recently in Hopewell, New Jersey by the Watershed Institute. This is an example of a downspout that's been directed into a planter and some gravel to solve a flooding problem along a driveway. Here's a green roof. This is actually, the rain garden is a picture at our Watershed Center. You can see that kind of beak-looking aspect to the roof. All of the water pours off that roof into the rain garden. And then some rain barrels here at a park at Mercer Meadows. And some more examples in a more urban context of how green infrastructure can be integrated to create green streets. So since 2004, New Jersey has had a set of stormwater management rules that have been incorporated into the ordinances in all of our municipalities. There are three components to our stormwater management. New development has to prove how it will manage the quantity of water to reduce runoff, the quality of water so that sediment isn't running off, and to show the ability to provide recharge so we aren't depleting our aquifers. The use of green infrastructure has been suggested but not required, and not actually very frequently used. And there's been no requirement to manage stormwater for minor development, that's that residential development, or when properties are redeveloped. And as we know here in New Jersey, a lot of the development preceded stormwater management. So if stormwater management isn't required when we redevelop properties, we're really never going to have the ability to make a meaningful impact on our water quality and to address this polluted stormwater runoff issue. So as I said, in March, the DEP issued what's called the Green Infrastructure Rule. And one of the things this rule does is it requires each municipality to update their stormwater management ordinance. This rule is exciting because it requires the use of green infrastructure. And this will encourage smaller systems that treat stormwater closer to its source. And will have all those benefits that we talked about to reduce flooding and to improve water quality. However, still, it only applies to those new, what are called major developments. So those are developments that impact over 1 acre of soil disturbance or add more than 1/4 acre of impervious cover. It does not address redevelopment either, but it does continue to require treatment for quantity, quality, and recharge. So what the rule doesn't do, that we at the Watershed really believe that towns should take action to add into their stormwater management ordinance to address residential development by requiring stormwater management for that, to address redevelopment, to require stormwater management when properties are redeveloped, to leverage natural features of the site like native ground cover and existing trees, and to require treatment for quality for runoff from all impervious surfaces for major development. The Green Infrastructure Rule from the state only requires quality treatment for runoff from motor vehicle surfaces. And we think that roofs and sidewalks, et cetera, should also be addressed. So the way in which you can help, and I know that as a follow-up to this webinar, there is actually a letter that you can send, but to contact your local environmental commission and your local elected officials. Tell them that this issue matters to you. ask them what the process will be to develop the ordinance in your town and when the opportunity will be for community input. At the Watershed, we've developed a model ordinance that incorporates the enhancements that we're recommending, and I've only had time to cover the major ones tonight, but there are some other enhancements that are included in there. And really to ask you to join the conversation about water quality and flooding and stormwater management in your community to help to raise what we call the water IQ, so that people know what their water quality is, how much impervious cover they have, where are the flooding issues, and to help to implement green infrastructure projects, because this is a new way of managing our stormwater, and more projects will mean more familiarity. And the way that we are looking at success is how many towns will adopt stronger stormwater managements than the state standard. How much education can we do on green infrastructure with engineers, landscape architects, and the public? How many green infrastructure projects can we get installed? So with that, I thank you so much for your time this evening. Here is my contact information and the contact information for Mike Pissarro, the policy director at the Watershed. And I look forward to Jason's presentation because I think they're very complementary.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie. And while I'm introducing Jason, I might suggest that you put it in you put your contact information in the chat. This way people can just copy and paste it right onto, call you tomorrow. But we'll have other things for you to do. So, so now I'm going to introduce Dr. Jason Adolf. He'll be speaking next. And he right now is Monmouth University of Science's very first endowed associate professor of marine science. And that was as of 2017. He spent several years at University of Hawaii in Hilo, where he was the chair and associate professor of marine science. His significant contributions to literature in the areas of algae bloom, algal, you'll pronounce it correctly, Jason. And then University of Maryland, 5 years, Institute of Marine and Environmental Technology in Baltimore, conducted harmful algal bloom research that included the Chesapeake Bay. So he studied it everywhere. The Swan River estuary in Perth, Australia. He studied algal blooms. And Plymouth Culture Collection of Marine Biological Association in the United Kingdom. So he's got a lot going on. And without further ado, Jason, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Mary, for the introduction. And let's see, I'm trying to get my.
Okay, we can, looks good here.
Yep.
Oh, Jason, or whatever you had before.
Is this good?
Now you're back in presenter mode.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I know what I did.
Whatever you had in the beginning.
Okay.
There.
Okay, can you see this little laser pointer I've got?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you very much, Mary, for the intro, and Sophie for the excellent introduction. I have a, I think relatively short, as I set my timer, 15-minute or so presentation that I want to tell you about the research that my students and I do in collaboration with the state of New Jersey on Monmouth County's coastal lakes and beaches and how that relates to stormwater issues of the sort that Sophie just detailed. So I'm essentially an ecologist, technically a phytoplankton ecologist. That's my area of study. And throughout my career, I've been interested in how different things happening in the environment drive ecosystem change, whether that's over seasonal scales or daily scales or event scales like river flooding. And more often I've worked with rivers and estuaries and embayments in the coastal ocean. Coming to New Jersey, I started to work with essentially stormwater runoff as that freshwater input system to coastal ecosystems, because that's the environment in which I find myself now, where it's very important. And as a predictor of things and as a proxy for stormwater runoff, I use the publicly available rainfall data that can be found in many different places. And this is another version here, this graph of what Sophie just showed, showing that rainfall has increased, yes, but within the last several decades, we've seen more large rainfall events, especially. And if you're familiar with coastal flooding and how things react, you know that it's those big dumping storms that really cause the biggest problems. So the two ecosystems and research areas I'm going to talk about are coastal lakes in Monmouth County, and they're shown here on this map from Lake Tackanassie up in Long Branch down to Wreck Pond. The color of the dot gives us an idea of the salinity in those ponds. They're mostly fresh. Wreck Pond has some salt water in it. And importantly from this map, you can see how developed the watershed is surrounding these lakes. As many of you know, these lakes are also part of municipal stormwater management plans. They basically pump it all into the lake and let the lake deal with it. The other system I'm going to talk about are surfing beaches that have, again in Monmouth County, that have these stormwater outflows at them. This is Roosevelt Avenue, the Deal Fishing Beach. And this project is supported by a collaboration with the Surfers Environmental Alliance that I'll talk about. So let's start off in the coastal lakes. Part of the coastal lakes research is a great citizen science effort where teams of citizen scientists currently working at 7 of the 10 lakes sample basic water quality. They've been doing so since May of 2019 and are continuing to do so through today. This is the most recently updated time series. The different colored dots represent different lakes shown in the legend here. This is temperature in the lakes, a nice curve like you would expect, an annual cycle. And what's interesting about the data is that sunlight temperature, as you would expect, is pretty similar among lakes, but then there are real differences in key indicators of lake water quality, like Secchi depth. This yellow is Lake Tackanassie, and it last year at least had a much more clear water body than neighboring lakes. One of the worst on the block was Sunset Lake in Asbury Park with a very low depth, Secchi depth down here, not very clear water. Another way to look at that is just to take the average of all the samples taken, and you can see that there are these big differences among the lakes. The basic research question that my students and I are pursuing is what causes these differences? Some of it is rainfall over time. Some of it is the watershed characteristics of the lakes themselves. While the citizen scientists are sampling water quality, my students and I are sampling harmful algal bloom abundance, and these time series for each of the lake run also from May 2019 through current times. The cyan colored greenish line is harmful algal bloom abundance. And what I want you to look at and take away from these graphs is that not all lakes experience harmful algal blooms. I'll point out Tackanassie again. There's negligible cyanobacteria harmful algal bloom biomass in that lake. Whereas Deal Lake, on the other hand, in 2019 and again in 2020, and Sunset Lake, 19 and 20, both I've been seeing these recurring harmful algal blooms. Fletcher Lake gets a little spike, but not much this year. And so again, what we want to know among these lakes, we have this experimental system. We can ask the questions, what is different amongst these lakes that makes some habby, as I love to say, more habby, and others less habby? And we addressed that question through a collaboration with the state where they did all sorts of nutrient measurements for us. And the answer was pretty simple. The best correlate of Hab abundance in the lakes was total nitrogen in the lake. So how much nitrogen was getting into the lakes. You can see that the lakes, each point here is 16 measurements taken between 2019 and 20 average for both nitrogen and Hab biomass. And of all the correlates, it was the best, and it's a really good correlation. That's saying that the more nitrogen gets into these lakes, the more harmful algal bloom biomass they develop over the summer. Takanasi again down here. Now it's a peachy color. Very little nitrogen and low Habs. And Sunset Lake, very high total nitrogen and high Habs. We also measured total phosphorus, inorganic phosphorus and nitrogen, pH, water clarity, temperature, and all these things, and those are important, but they did not explain the differences in Hab among the lakes over this season. Phosphorus is often pointed to as a driver of harmful algal blooms, and what we found is that the lakes that have blooms in them have so much phosphorus coming from somewhere, likely the sediments, that it's in excess. There's more phosphorus than they can use. They're limited by nitrogen. You have to add more nitrogen to get more harmful algal bloom biomass. So the phosphorus is there already, and stormwater is, of course, a source of both nitrogen and phosphorus. Nitrogen is very soluble and very mobile with stormwater, flows very easily with stormwater. Phosphorus is different. It likes to stick to sediments. So you need those big flooding rains that bring sediments into the lakes from the watershed to deliver the phosphorus. And then once it's there, it's there. It stays there until you dredge it out or flush it out. So what we've turned to looking at now, and this is work that my students Carly Nolan and Mary Reilly have done this summer, is looking at more short-term dynamics between rainfall and Habs in these lakes. And this is part of Carly's analysis from this summer. And what we saw was at the beginning of the season, before there was a Hab in Deal Lake and in Sunset, there was a large rainfall event that was then followed 2 weeks later by the beginning of the Hab bloom. So what we're in the process of doing now is going back through our archive data on Habs to really look more closely at, do we see this kind of pattern, this kind of cause and effect on the week to 2 week time scale between rainfall events and Habs forming in the different years that we've been sampling. And I suspect we will. This is showing a rainfall event that caused a change in the trajectory of Habs, a little bump following a rainfall event. And we know from measurements the DP has made that these rainfall events do bring lots of nitrogen into the lakes. So let's shift gears and talk about microbial pollution and rainfall at surfing beaches in Monmouth County, the other project I wanted to cover today. Richard Lee and the Surface Environmental Alliance came to us and pointed out all these anecdotal links between FIBs, which is short for fecal indicator bacteria, which is as disgusting as it sounds. It's a bacterium that is an indicator of other animal waste related contaminants, but it's something that we can measure in the water. Links between that and rainfall at stormwater outfalls. And so with the anecdotal information in hand, we wanted to address the question, how well can we predict? Can you actually model microbial pollution at surfing beaches based on how much it's rained in the previous history before you've sampled? How well can you actually make that model to take it a step beyond the anecdotal realm? So we, with Surface Environmental Alliance, chose 5 sites between Ocean Place in Long Branch, South Bath Avenue, Roosevelt Avenue at Deal, Neptune Avenue in Deal, and Wesley Lake outfall in Asbury Park. And there are rain gauges existing at these locations here already. So we had our rain data, and we started sampling them in before and after rainstorm events. And the first thing I want to point out that although all these beaches have stormwater outfalls at them, they're different. Roosevelt Avenue and stations 4 or 5, which are Bath Avenue and Ocean Place, have the kind that go offshore and you see a little marker at the end of it. Neptune Avenue and Deal, the outfall pipe is actually on the foredune end of the beach, away from the water. So it drains onto the sand, then runs into the water. And then Wesley Lake was an odd man out because it drains a coastal lake, Wesley Lake, different from the other stations. So what we did, we targeted sampling between 7 and 10 a.m. as if somebody was going to the beach in the morning. We used a technique called IDEX to measure Enterococcus as our fecal indicator bacterium. So we'd collect samples of the beach and water quality measurements and take it back to the lab and do our microbial assay, and then put them together with rainfall data that we collected from this DEP Rutgers rainfall site from these locations. And we tested different measures of rainfall. We ended up, what I'm going to show you today is how microbial pollution relates to rainfall that's occurred in the 6 hours before we sampled. So the 6 hour prior cumulative rainfall amounts. And I will mention here that was one of the better predictors. 24-hour rainfall doesn't work because sometimes if it doesn't rain within 12 hours, but it all rained 24 hours ago, things clear up, thankfully, relatively quickly. So one of the first things we noticed, and we're working with 125 observations between these dates, is that there were significant differences between beaches that we sampled. Mainly Neptune Avenue didn't show as much microbial pollution as the other beaches. And if you remember, Neptune Avenue drained onto the sand. These drained onto out pipes that are into the water. And that was a statistically significant difference. If I put a line on this chart, it shows the 104 colony forming units per 100 milliliter. That is the federal and state threshold for an actionable level of Enterococcus. So above that is bad, below that is good. And you can see that even though there are differences, all of them at one time or another had levels well above that. And note that this is a log scale, so that's 10, that's 100. The line is at 104, and that's 1,000. And the next would be 10,000. So differences between sites. The site that drains onto the sand, maybe not surprisingly, seems to be the least dirty after a rainstorm. Then what we were able to do with that was get to modeling, and I used something called a logistic regression model, and was able to make statistically significant models at 2 of our sites, Ocean Place and Roosevelt Avenue. What these models are saying is, based on how much rain has occurred in the prior 6 hours before sampling, the line tells us what the probability is that if you tested that water, it would come up hot, or it would be above the Enterococcus threshold. So at Ocean Place and Roosevelt Avenue, basically the steeper the curve here, the worse off a site is. Roosevelt Avenue was the worst in the lot. You can see at even 0.2 inches of rain, you're almost at a 50-50 chance of having higher than acceptable levels of Enterococcus. And that's a statistically significant model. Ocean Place at 0.2 inches of rain, you're still down around a 0.2 probability of seeing high enterococcus. So from this study, we can conclude that rainfall is a good predictor of enterococcus for some sites, and we're continuing to collect data. The other thing I need to point out about these is that even at low rainfall or no rainfall within the 6 previous hours, there are still some positives. These don't end at zero. Zero rainfall, there's still a 20% chance at Roosevelt Avenue of finding unacceptable levels of enterococcus, a 10% chance at Ocean Place, 10% chance at Neptune. And that may have to do with rain that occurred 12 or 24 hours previous, but it doesn't always. I can tell you that from looking at the data set. And what I would like to do with models like this in the future, rainfall data is fed in real time, free and publicly available. If we have these models in an app, somebody can just punch in the time that they're going surfing and where they're going surfing, and we could feed back the probability that the water contains above acceptable levels of enterococcus with more data and more development of these models. So in conclusion, coastal ecosystems are certainly complex, but rainfall and stormwater runoff do explain some of the variability in things like harmful algal blooms and microbial pollution at surfing beaches, and we're continuing to work on both of these.
Yeah.
The reason,
Sorry, you have a few questions when you finish. Go ahead.
yeah, that's fantastic. The reason I'm so interested in modeling beyond anecdotal evidence is because a model can be tested after we've taken action to mitigate the problem. And the model tells you how sensitive a system is to a certain driver like rainfall. And if we make watershed changes, how we can look at the efficacy of those changes. Did it really impact the system, or is the system still the same as it was?
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, in my 3 years of doing ecology in New Jersey, I'm convinced that stormwater management is, for these sorts of systems in this sort of environment, is essential for getting these systems in better shape.
Yeah.
So that's all I have. I have to thank my lab group, and I have to point out these pictures here. My first summer lab group, my second summer lab group. This summer, all the students and a lot of the work I showed was done remotely. Monmouth University was closed through the end of July. And so I really thank the students for stepping up and getting stuff done and continuing to work. Richard Lee, John Gossert, and Jamie Laviola at Surface Environmental Alliance, and Bob Schuster, Bill Hedendorf, Eric Ernst in the Leeds Point Lab for nutrient analyses on the CLONET project. And I have to mention too that it's the Jules L. Plangier Foundation who is funding the CLONET project and has been from the start. So great thanks to them. I'm anxious to take any questions, and thank you again.
Okay, thank you. That was really interesting. And there's some questions in the chat, and I'm going to start off with one from Steve Foster. And he said, is this phenomenon due to combined sewer overflow issues or a standalone stormwater runoff from properties?
So my understanding is that none of the pipes that we're working at are CSOs. They're all stormwater runoff, and there's the chance of an illicit connection to that, but they're not CSOs for sure. I did forget to point out that Roosevelt Avenue and the Deal Fishing Beach, you can see the stormwater pipe, but offshore a little bit and underwater is the sewer outflow from the wastewater treatment plant up in Oakhurst or Deal or up the road a little bit.
Okay. I have another question about that, but let's go on to Kari Martin. Is there a map or list where all stormwater outfalls are in the ocean and in the lakes and rivers in New Jersey?
I think I've seen that. For the, I'm hesitant to answer for the entire state. I know that there are, most of the stormwater outfalls are visible on things like Google Earth. But yeah, I can't answer that question directly. I'm not sure. I think there is.
Okay.
There should be. If they're not, it's a great question.
Yeah, and Kari is from Clean Ocean Action. So Kari, if you have a follow-up, go ahead and put it in chat. And in the meantime, Philip Falcone said seabirds congregate near South Bath Avenue shoreline. Does that affect microbial pollution?
It could potentially. It could potentially be a signal, although that's why we sample both dry days and rainy days, because the dry days are really control for non-storm drain effects. And like I said, some of the sites show unacceptable levels of enterococcus during dry conditions, but it's not nearly as common as after a rainfall event. But then again, rainfall could be washing enterococcus into the water from the beach as well.
Okay. So this is from Francis Tablet. Are stormwater outflows pipes into public waterways required to be marked or labeled so that beachside can know what they are and what they contain, or what they could contain?
Apparently not, because I had no idea what these pipes were until Richard Lee and John Gosser from SEA started taking me around and pointing out where all these pipes were. I had an idea of that they were draining something, but but they're the only markings I can tell on these. There's no marking as to what they are. There's what appears to be a navigational aid, a post at the end of the pipe to keep people from crashing into them in boats when they're far out.
Yeah.
But there's no sign on it that says this is a stormwater drain, or this is a CSO, or this is a anything that I can see.
Right. And then, so someone asked if the webinar is recorded. It is. Somebody else asked if the slides can be shared, and Sophie, I was able to chat her while Jason, you were giving your presentation, and she's willing to share her slides. If you would, you be willing?
I can.
Okay, cool. All right, and then one thing I don't want to, let's see. Usually DEP might not allow public access to such kinds of maps. And this is from Bushra. So I'm not aware of that.
What maps?
The maps that Kari was asking about.
Oh.
Yeah. So there's a lot that, yeah. So before we go away, one of the things I want to encourage everyone to do, and I'm going to share my screen, Jason, if you want to get off. Okay. This is set up to talk to, I'm going to make this full screen so you can, come on. So you can see it. Here we go. And I'm going to give you this right now to everybody. But you can go in, fill this out. It will go right to your administrator. It will go right to your town council. I filled it out earlier today, and I, checked to see who it went to, and it came, my town council came right up. So this is a really great way of getting involved. It's a really great way of being direct, and we recommend you do it right now. And while everybody's clicking away, I have a few questions. So Sophie, for you, is there any kind of measure in terms of water runoff from a property? As a property owner, could somebody measure the runoff so that if they implement changes, they know what the difference is?
Well, let me think about that. I mean, you can definitely calculate your stormwater runoff based on the square footage of your roof, for example, in a typical storm. And then there are resources available where then you could size a rain garden, for example, or try and understand how much stormwater you have to manage. And Rutgers has some amazing resources for this. If you just Google Rutgers Green Infrastructure, they have a very good green infrastructure manual with a lot of good explanation for how to design your rain garden and other good introductions to different green infrastructure strategies.
Okay, that's great. Rutgers.
I believe it's a water resources group, I'm pretty sure.
All right, I'm going to put that in chat. In the meantime, Heather Safford has asked, have any towns adopted stronger stormwater controls than the state? Are there any incentives other than better water quality to do so?
Yes, I've had personal experience with this because we have in Princeton adopted a requirement for minor development. So anyone who adds more than 400 square feet of impervious cover needs to manage their stormwater. And really the driving factor behind the adoption of this is our flooding issues. It is amazing how widespread they are. They're getting worse. People are experiencing erosion. When there's construction next to them, basements are flooding that didn't used to flood.
Yeah.
And I think people are really starting to understand that we're really reaching a tipping point and we need to invest in managing the problem.
Yeah. I was on the Cranford Green Team and also the Environmental Commission, and Cranford literally has a river that runs through it. So the Environmental Commission would review anything that got built. I mean, if you wanted to put a deck on your, a new deck, then that would have to go through the Environmental Commission too, for good reason. People would do things like wanted to put a pool in the flood zone or something like that. Like you can't do that if you have a river. So my sense is that they were very stringent about it. But for the same reason, they had run right up to the edge of, the flood capacity because the river was right there. It was, and we didn't want to make it part of the street any more often than we really need.
The other thing that's been interesting is our public health and safety team has been very interested in collaborating on this issue because flooding has become a real safety issue. And so that was another driving factor.
Ah, that's interesting. Yeah. Okay, so somebody is telling me that the link doesn't work. Let me try it again.
The other thing I would just say is in this time of the COVID pandemic, many of these municipal meetings have moved online. So it's actually even easier to attend. You can often click a Zoom link. Yeah. And sometimes this issue of stormwater can seem, I think, technical. And I think that everybody should just feel comfortable asking the common sense questions of what's the impervious surface in our town? How much flooding are we experiencing? Let your elected officials know the statistics about water quality and just becoming part of the conversation.
Yeah, especially at the town level. At the town level, these are just people. Having been involved in the Green Team, that was my first experience in getting involved with municipal government. And if, a couple people showed up and voiced their opinion every time, then when they'd go to review something that had to do with impervious surface or putting in a new parking lot, then they'd say, oh, you know, so-and-so's going to be here and talk to us about impervious surface. And that's good. We want them to have us top of mind when they think about this stuff, because
Well, I was also on this webinar today and it was talking about the effectiveness of using stories in advocacy. And I think to take stories, you know, even what Jason is telling us is a little bit of a story, and to take your elected officials, ask them if they want to go and see where the pipe is, and tell them about Jason and his students, and just kind of making those connections.
right. Yeah, that's a good point. And actually, Jason, I have a question about why are all the stormwater out from the towns to the beach on the surfing beaches?
Oh, they're not necessarily. We targeted surfing beaches with those outfalls.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I mean there are surfing beaches that aren't don't have outfalls, and we've done a little bit of sampling around them as well. But our experiment was really designed around wet versus dry conditions at these beaches with outfalls.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Surfing beach just makes it kind of more of a story. All right. Let's see. Oh. So I'm just reading through the chats. I want to make sure I don't miss anything. All right. And all right. So does anybody have any last questions? First of all, everybody, thank you for typing away in it. And thank you in advance for sending in these letters. It would be great to get, you know, a big push, especially along the ocean. And we're a densely populated state. There's a lot of things we just can't overlook, and think, especially with sea level rise and so forth. So, so thank you everybody for being involved. Kari Martin, if you want to, did you chat again? I just don't want to, I want to make sure I don't miss your question. And by the way, I can see you. So if you like shake your head yes, or you're good. Okay, awesome. Thank you. All right. All right. So listen, I think that's it. I don't think there are any more questions. I want to say you guys did a great job. I really, really enjoyed it. I really learned a lot. I learned more than, I'm like a good student, but sort of like a don't want to go before I go, and then I'm here and I'm really involved. So thank you. You both did a really great job, and you can see the thank yous coming up from everybody who is still on. So yeah.
Thank you,
All right.
Mary and Sophie.
All right. So everybody stay tuned. We have another presentation coming up on October 5th. And we really appreciate your time and your energy. Take care.
Good night.